All right, so you know how much we love getting deep into the weeds of philosophy. Well, this time, you, dear listener, have led us to a thinker who is all about connecting science and philosophy in a way that's still so relevant today. We're talking about Herbert Feigl, a real pioneer in bridging those two worlds, especially when it comes to the tricky relationship between logical empiricism and scientific realism. Oh, and we can't forget his fascinating take on the mind-body problem, a classic philosophical puzzle.
Right. Feigl was this incredible Austrian intellectual who really flourished in the U.S., and his whole project was about grounding philosophy in what he called the scientific attitude. And I think that's something that should resonate with anyone who wants their philosophical ideas to be connected to the real world.
And to really get a handle on Feigl's contributions, we're going to delve into three main areas of his work: his philosophy of probability, his stance on the scientific realism debate, and of course his influential analysis of the mind-body problem. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we've got to start where he did, with the Vienna Circle.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about Feigl just being a member. He was a co-founder of the Vienna Circle, this super influential group that shaped a lot of 20th century analytic philosophy. He was right there with giants like Schlick, Hahn, and Neurath, helping to set their initial intellectual agenda.
So let's rewind to the early days. You know how the Vienna Circle was initially all about Wittgenstein's Tractatus, especially when it came to the logical foundations of math and science. So how did Feigl's early work fit into that whole intellectual scene?
Well, Feigl's doctoral work, which he titled Chance and Law, was really an exploration of probability, how it actually works. He was super influenced by Zilsel and took a very pragmatic, you could say Humean approach to induction. And what's interesting is that he disagreed with Reichenbach's ideas about induction, arguing for a vindication of it rather than a validation. His main point was that probability, since it's based on this idea of limiting frequencies in infinite sequences, it actually has to presuppose induction in a way. So induction kind of had to come first.
Okay, that is subtle, but I see how it's a really important distinction. But as I understand it, Feigl later on realized there was a pretty big limitation in this early work, right?
Yeah, exactly. He admitted that his early thinking about probability didn't really consider the implications of quantum mechanics, which is a big deal at the time.
And how did that, dealing with quantum mechanics, how did that shape his later work?
Well, it directly led to his 1929 book, Theorie und Erfahrung in der Physik. This translates to Theory and Experience in Physics. And in this book, Feigl really wrestled with how quantum mechanics changed our understanding of scientific explanation, even the structure of scientific theories. He was putting forward ideas that actually ended up foreshadowing the hypothetico-deductive model that Popper and Hempel would become known for. And something that's important for his overall philosophical position, in this book, he firmly planted himself as a critical realist. He was pushing back against the subjectivism of Kantianism and the idea that scientific truth is just a matter of convention.
So, critical realist at this point, what does that really mean for someone like Feigl?
At its core, it means that while he acknowledges that our theories shape how we see the world, Feigl believed that these theories are actually trying to describe a reality that exists independently of our minds. He didn't want to say that our scientific models are just useful fictions or purely determined by how we observe things.
And was this critical realist view the dominant one within the Vienna Circle?
Well, not really. Later on, Feigl described his position as he actually used the words loyal opposition. He felt really connected to the circle's emphasis on logic and empirical grounding, but he got more and more worried about the shift towards phenomenalistic positivism. This is the view that really emphasized reducing everything to sense experience. And this was championed by folks like Schlick and Weissman, who were influenced by Carnap and the early Wittgenstein. So Feigl, along with thinkers like Popper, Reichenbach, and Zilsel, they wanted to hold on to a stronger form of critical realism. And they actually found inspiration in Schlick's earlier work, which leaned more towards realism.
It's interesting how, even in such an influential movement, there were these internal tensions and debates. And this actually perfectly sets the stage for understanding Feigl's later work on logical empiricism and scientific realism, an area where a lot of people see a fundamental conflict.
Exactly. The typical story in philosophy often presents logical empiricism and scientific realism as being like oil and water, totally incompatible.
Yeah.
But Feigl's journey is super interesting because he really tried to bridge that supposed gap. He built on the early realism he saw in Schlick, finding common ground with thinkers like Reichenbach and Keila, aiming to bring together the rigor of logical empiricism with a realist view of the things that our best scientific theories talk about.
So how did he attempt this reconciliation? What were his main arguments?
In the beginning, there's a 1931 article he co-authored with Bloomberg, Logical Positivism, a new movement in European philosophy. And they presented logical positivism as this fusion, this bringing together of classic empiricism with the strength of modern logic. A core principle was that they rejected metaphysics as meaningless, and this included dismissing Kant's synthetic a priori judgments.
Meaningless in the sense that metaphysical claims couldn't be verified by experience, or like they didn't have any real-world content.
Precisely. They maintain this sharp line between analytic propositions, which are true by definition, things in logic and mathematics, which they saw as tautological following Wittgenstein, and then synthetic propositions, the ones that get their truth value from experience. They even embraced this ambitious project, taking a cue from Carnap's Aufbau, to try to demonstrate how all meaningful empirical concepts could be logically built up from a single primitive notion of the similarity of our memories. They emphasize the publicly communicable structure of experience. Think of it like trying to construct the entire building of empirical knowledge from the most basic sensory building blocks.
That sounds like a strong commitment to the verification principle, like in its early, most strict form.
It was. But Feigl himself later on marked a significant shift in his thinking around 1935, and he started to prefer the label logical empiricist over logical positivist. This change was partly because of all the criticism directed at logical positivism, especially the strict verification criterion of meaning. Many philosophers, even within the movement, started to see it as too restrictive.
So this move to logical empiricism was a loosening of those strict requirements for meaning.
Exactly. The focus shifted from needing direct verifiability to more flexible ideas like testability or confirmability. However, the core commitment to rejecting what they saw as transcendent metaphysics, claims that couldn't be empirically checked, even in principle, that remained strong. In his 1954 paper, Scientific Method Without Metaphysical Presuppositions, Feigl was very clear that he still objected to untestable assertions and any belief in a priori factual truths about the world.
But this liberalization, moving towards confirmability, this is what opened the door for his embrace of scientific realism, right?
Absolutely. Feigl felt that this phenomenalistic reduction, the idea that you could reduce talk about physical objects to talk about patterns of sense data, which was popular in some parts of the Vienna Circle, he felt it went too far. He and Reichenbach had already expressed doubts about this back in the 1920s, finding more common ground with the realism advocated by Zilsel and Popper. So Feigl's aim was to bring back a more defensible form of critical realism. In his 1943 article, Logical Empiricism, he actually offered a definition of real. He said what's real is what occupies a place in space-time and has causal relations. Using this definition, theoretical entities like atoms, even though you can't observe them directly, they're still empirically testable because of their causal effects on things we can observe. So for him, this made them just as real as everyday objects.
So to be real for Feigl, something had to be part of the causal network of the world.
Exactly. If we could get empirical evidence to support the idea that something plays a causal role in the world within space and time, then we're good to consider it real. And he argued that this realist perspective was a natural outcome of the more open-minded meaning criterion, recognizing that a lot of what we know comes indirectly through inference and interpretation.
And all this leads up to his important 1950 article, Existential Hypotheses. This is where he introduces this key idea of semantic realism, right? Feels like a turning point in his thinking.
It really was. Here, Feigl turns to semantics. This is the study of how language refers to things in the world, how propositions have truth values. And he used this as the foundation for his realism. He stressed the difference between what our terms refer to and the evidence we have for them, and similarly, the difference between the truth of a statement and our ability to verify it. This allowed him to criticize what he called the reductive fallacies of phenomenalism, and this was seen in the logical constructivism of Russell and the early Carnap, who tried to translate statements about theoretical entities into statements only about immediate sensory experience. The big thing here is that Feigl freed theoretical language from being directly tied to immediate experience. Scientific theories could now genuinely refer to things we can't observe, which is huge for a robust understanding of science.
So she was arguing that when scientists talk about electrons or genes, they're not just using shorthand for patterns of observations, they're actually talking about things that exist independently of our minds.
Exactly. He believed that these theoretical terms have what he called surplus meaning, beyond what you could capture in purely observational language. And this surplus meaning is in their factual reference to things that exist, whether we're aware of them or not. It's real atoms out there, not just logical constructions from sense data. He highlighted the key difference between epistemic reduction, which is about how we get our knowledge, and factual reference, which is about what that knowledge is actually about. For Feigl, the meaning of the sentence is all about its truth conditions, the conditions that have to be met in the world for the sentence to be true. And these conditions are met when the things the sentence talks about actually exist and are related in the way the sentence describes, regardless of whether we can verify that right now.
But he was careful to separate this semantic scientific realism from the more traditional metaphysical realism, which often has claims that are beyond empirical testing, right?
That's absolutely essential. Feigl was very wary of metaphysical realism, which relies on statements that seem impossible to test scientifically. He insisted that for a statement to be meaningful, even if it's about things we can't directly observe, it has to be confirmable in principle through empirical evidence, even if that confirmation is indirect or complicated. He famously said, "No concrete existential hypothesis is factually meaningful unless it is confirmable, allows as much realism as we are ever likely to warrant." He saw his approach as a careful balancing act between the core empiricist need for confirmability and the very intuitive, and he'd argue necessary, realism that underlies how we do science.
That sounds like a really tricky balance to strike. And I understand this position wasn't without its critics, even among other logical empiricists.
You're right. Philosophers like Frank, Hempel, and Nagel, also important figures in the logical empiricist movement, they had objections. They said that Feigl's reliance on confirmability, even in its more relaxed form, still kept him within the boundaries of logical positivism. They questioned if his talk of realism really added something new to the conversation, suggesting it might be more of a difference in emphasis than a fundamentally distinct philosophical position. They wondered if he was making a distinction without a practical difference.
So how did Feigl respond to these criticisms from within his own camp? Did he try to clarify the distinction further?
He pointed to the potential of Wilfrid Sellars' concept of pure pragmatics as a way to bridge the gap between semantics, how language refers, and epistemology, how we acquire knowledge. However, this pure pragmatics is a dense concept, and many scholars point out that the exact way it could defend Feigl's specific kind of realism is still being debated. It was more like a suggestion for future research than a fully formed argument.
It seems like Feigl was constantly pushing the limits of logical empiricism, trying to make space for a stronger, realist view of scientific knowledge. Let's shift gears now to what's probably his best known and most debated contribution, his analysis of the mind-body problem.
Absolutely. Feigl's work on the mind-body problem, especially his development of the identity theory, is a landmark in 20th century analytic philosophy. It's often grouped with the similar views coming from Australian materialist philosophers like Place, Smart, and Armstrong, all committed to a non-dualistic physicalist understanding of the mind. But it's crucial for any philosopher engaging with this to see the unique aspects of Feigl's contribution.
So what were the key differences between Feigl's approach to the mind-body problem and that of the Australian materialists?
Well, the Australians often started with the physical realm, particularly the brain, as the primary and relatively unproblematic basis for understanding the mind. They then aimed to reduce mental states to physical states. But Feigl, interestingly, took a slightly different route. He started by focusing on the mental, specifically our direct subjective experiences, what we call qualia, or raw feels. For him, these were the more immediately given aspect of reality for each of us. His project then became about integrating these seemingly subjective experiences into a broader physicalist worldview. Essentially, Feigl argued that, say, the feeling of pain and the firing of certain neurons aren't two separate things, but two different ways of knowing the same underlying reality, which is a simple but profound idea.
So there's a significant difference in where they begin and what they emphasize. And the source material mentions that Feigl was influenced by earlier thinkers in 19th century German and Austrian philosophy.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Alois Real, who advocated for a type of critical realism, and even more importantly, the early Moritz Schlick, were major influences on Feigl's development of the identity theory. Schlick, in his double knowledge or double language theory, proposed that the mental and the physical aren't different substances or entities, but two distinct conceptual systems, two different ways of understanding the same reality. He framed it primarily as an epistemological problem, a problem of how we know, rather than a metaphysical problem about what ultimately exists. Schlick famously stated that the relation between the mental and physical is no longer one of causal dependency, but of simple identity, one and the same reality, designated by two different conceptual systems.
So Feigl saw his own identity theory as building on this foundation laid by Schlick.
For sure. Feigl's central question was, How are these raw feels, these subjective experiences, related to the observable behavior and the underlying neurophysiological states of the brain? He rejected dualistic ideas that proposed fundamentally different kinds of substances or properties, and he also rejected reductive materialist views like eliminative materialism and radical behaviorism that basically denied the existence or importance of subjective experience. He favored a monistic solution based on the principle of parsimony, which is the idea that we shouldn't multiply entities unnecessarily. He argued that it was less economical and less elegant to say there are two fundamentally different things when the empirical evidence pointed toward a strong correlation between mental states and brain states. As he put it, the principle of parsimony opposes talking about two concepts if the evidential facts, though completely correlated, are qualitatively heterogeneous.
And his double language theory, which he built on Schlick's ideas, was his way of articulating this monistic solution.
Yes, exactly. Feigl, like Schlick, drew this crucial line between the evidence, the way we come to know something, and what that evidence is actually about, what it refers to. He argued that mental states are the same things as certain physical states in the brain, but we have two completely different ways of accessing or knowing about them. We have direct, first-person access through introspection, knowledge by acquaintance, which gives us our experience of qualia, and then we have indirect, third-person access through scientific observation behavior, and importantly, the neurophysiological processes in the brain, what he called knowledge by description. This referential identity, as he termed it, is like Frige's famous example of the morning star and the evening star, two different ways of referring to and knowing about the same thing, which is Venus.
So two different ways of getting at and describing the same underlying reality.
Precisely. This led to Feigl's idea of double knowledge. What we experience directly, the had-in experience, something we know by being directly aware of it, is identical to what the science of neurophysiology describes, or will describe more accurately as our scientific understanding improves, as specific brain processes. He explicitly identified his view as a modern take on the double knowledge theory held by various monistic critical realists before him.
And Feigl highlighted two particularly interesting, maybe even surprising aspects of his version of this identity theory.
Yeah, there are two things that stand out. First, he saw qualia, those raw subjective feelings of experience like the redness of red or the painfulness of pain, as epistemologically basic realities. We have this privileged first-person access to them through what he called the egocentric account. He saw this immediate private experience as fundamental, even necessary for grounding our understanding and for hooking our own private language to the shared intersubjective language of science. Now, while emphasizing this private access, he also maintained a crucial belief that privacy is capable of public intersubjective description. This is where he differs from some of the Australian materialists who seem to downplay or even try to explain away the reality of qualia. Feigl even considered the idea that maybe all of reality at its most fundamental level might be at bottom qualitative, although he didn't fully endorse panpsychism.
That's a cool perspective, the idea that our most private experiences are somehow fundamental for our shared public scientific understanding. What was the second key aspect of his theory?
The second key aspect was that the mental physical identity is empirical and contingent. This is different from an earlier philosophical view, where you might argue for a logical or necessary identity between mind and body. Feigl later insisted that the connection between specific types of mental states and specific types of brain states wasn't something we could figure out through pure reasoning alone. Instead, he argued that this identity was a matter of empirical fact, something to be discovered and confirmed by scientific investigation. He emphasized that while philosophical analysis could help clarify the concepts and the logical possibilities, the ultimate proof for the identity had to come from the empirical findings of science, particularly psychology, psychophysics, and neurophysiology. As he put it, the available evidence points with remarkable consistency in the direction of a system of psychology, psychophysics, and psychophysiology, which provides for the monistic solution here outlined. But this is the empirical, the factual issue, which philosophical analysis cannot decide and should not prejudge.
So for Feigl, philosophy could provide the framework for understanding the mind-body relationship, but it was up to empirical science to provide the evidence for the specific identities.
You got it. He saw his philosophical approach as meta-scientific. It was about reflecting on and interpreting the results and methods of science rather than dictating its findings from an armchair. While big philosophical stances like monism and dualism might not be definitively provable or disprovable by empirical evidence alone, Feigl relied on a kind of pragmatic justification particularly the principle of parsimony, to favor his identity theory as the most reasonable and well-supported approach, given what we know scientifically.
It's clear that Feigl's articulation of the identity theory, with its emphasis on qualia and the idea that the identity is contingent, has been super influential and continues to drive a lot of the debate in philosophy of mind today.
Absolutely. Even though there have been criticisms of his specific formulation and many alternative theories have been proposed, there's no doubt that Feigl was crucial in setting the stage for the modern discussion of consciousness and the mind-body problem.
And besides his major contributions to the debates on scientific realism and the mind-body problem, Feigl also had a wider, lasting impact on 20th century analytic philosophy.
Right? A huge impact. His 1950 article on existential hypotheses, where he laid out his ideas on semantic realism, is now widely considered a landmark contribution to the scientific realism debate. It influenced later philosophers of science like Boyd, Loudon, and Putnam. There's even been a resurgence of interest in revisiting and maybe even reviving his specific realist framework in current philosophical discussions. And, as the philosopher Jae-Gwon Kim pointed out, it was Feigl, along with G.J.C. Smart, who really brought the mind-body problem into the mainstream of analytic philosophy as a central topic of inquiry.
And he wasn't just influential through his writing, he was also a key figure in shaping the institutions of philosophy.
For sure. He was the driving force behind the founding of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, which has become a really influential institution in the field. And he co-founded the highly respected journal Philosophical Studies, which has been a platform for the development and spread of analytic philosophy. On top of that, he co-edited several foundational collections of essays, like Readings in Philosophical Analysis and Readings in the Philosophy of Science, which helped define the core topics and approaches in the field for decades. And he was a passionate advocate for the importance of psychology as a rigorous and valuable academic discipline.
So it sounds like Feigl was a central figure in the development of analytic philosophy in the 20th century. He was really engaged with the scientific advancements of his time and always tried to connect the seemingly separate worlds of scientific inquiry and philosophical thought.
Exactly. Feigl himself said, "There is no sharp line of demarcation between good science and clear-headed philosophy. Doing philosophy in our days and age without regard to the problems and results of the sciences is, to put it mildly, intellectually unprofitable, if not irresponsible." And that's something that, for any philosopher trying to understand the world, still rings true today.
Considering Feigl's lifelong effort to connect our subjective experiences with the objective scientific understanding of the world, what do you think are the biggest challenges we still face in fully reconciling these two perspectives in contemporary philosophy? And do you think Feigl's emphasis on the role of confirmability is still a useful guide when we're navigating the complex claims of both science and metaphysics? It's definitely an area ripe for further philosophical exploration.